Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So, Nick, where does it go from here? I would suggest it gets worse for the Tories long before it gets better.
Yes, I mean, I think one thing that David Cameron and George Osborne might want to think carefully about is how they manage Ian Duncan Smith. And the pretty hostile briefing against him is only going to sort of increase his ire. And they should perhaps not forget that Ian Duncan Smith has quite an important weapon, which is the private correspondence with the Prime Minister's office in recent weeks about these changes to disability benefits, which show that the Prime Minister wanted to go much, much further than Ian Duncan Smith was willing to go. So when they say, well, these were your ideas, why is it a problem? Ian Duncan Smith's argument, obviously, is, well, yes, these were my ideas, but they were a part of a long-term sustainable plan. They were not about giving you, George Osborne, money to cut taxes for the wealthy, which is what he did in capital gains tax. So I think they probably need to handle Ian Duncan Smith with care, because he could be dangerous for them if he really is on the loose.
Because it's clear already that for every person Downing Street is briefing to have a go at Ian Duncan Smith, there's at least one other ready to have a go at Mr Cameron and the government.
Absolutely, and I can't remember a time since David Cameron became leader of the Conservative Party that discipline has broken down within his parliamentary party to such an extent as it has in the last 48 hours. I think it's very hard to see how he brings discipline back in before the referendum. I mean, his powers of patronage are very limited. He doesn't want to do a reshuffle, a big reshuffle before the referendum. He needs to wait. And there's a real feeling of kind of open season about
also,
all of this.
they all know he's on his way out.
Well, one other thing I would add, though, is it's not necessarily in Brexit's interests to whip this up too much into David Cameron's future, because the problem that Brexiteers have is the risk factor, that people worry about what a big leap it is into the unknown, as they put it, to vote for leave. If they also think they might be voting for a total change of government and a change of Prime Minister, that puts the stakes up even higher. So we may see the Leave campaigns trying to dampen this down a little bit.
Meanwhile, the Chancellor, who is now among the walking wounded, has still got a budget to get through Parliament, or certainly the House of Commons, which deals with money matters and on all sorts of things. He needs a vote to cut the capital gains tax, to cut the corporation tax, to raise the threshold for the 40% taxpayers. There's always a danger that when rebellion's in the air and the Tory backbenchers rebel against one thing, as they will do on disability, they could start rebelling on other things.
Yeah, there could be contagion. And I think he actually has two problems. The immediate is the thing you refer to, the legislative challenge of getting the CGT cut and the threshold raise and everything else through Parliament in the coming weeks and months. Then he has to find the money he has just lost by reversing on the disability benefit cut. Remember, he's already lost money from reversing the tax credit policy.
Which is why he broke his welfare cap.
Absolutely. And his last remaining target is the surplus target, and he'll be under pressure to abandon that as well. So even if he gets through this immediate challenge of getting the budget through Parliament, his central purpose as a politician is to close the deficit, and he has made it harder for himself by reversing on some of these contentious measures. So it's not as if the problem ends once the vote is done in a few weeks' time.
Isabel, is it not all made worse by the fact that this is now taking place in the midst of the EU referendum campaign, which had already divided the Conservatives, and this just is like pouring petrol on the flames?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's hard to see how we're going to have anything other than another 4 months of utter mayhem. And then, of course, we don't know what the result of the referendum will be. There's probably going to be a good deal of mayhem after that. I think it's interesting how quiet Boris Johnson has been. I understand he's away skiing, but we've not seen much from friends of Boris Johnson in the last 24 hours.
Maybe the lines are bad to the Alps.
I think that shows you just how serious the Boris operation is now. They are smart. They are not going to mess this up by being seen to wade in.
But you know what? I think if we had to sort of score this, I think this has been a good weekend for the Brexiteers, because their most high-profile member of the cabinet has resigned and appears to have been, you know, a bit bullied possibly by George Osborne. This is a man who really speaks from the heart of this, because he had this great, as I was saying earlier, visit to Easter House in Glasgow and got onto this issue. So in that sense, I think it's probably been a good weekend for the Brexiteers. But the problem for them is that you need to be talking about sort of the vision of Britain in the future, and this is quite Westminstery, it's quite insidery. And what the Brexiteers need to do is they need to sort of counter the Remain argument that they are the biggest risk. And whilst there may be sympathy for Ian Duncan Smith, I don't think that is getting them onto that sort of argument.
No, but the two leading spokesmen for the Remain campaign on the Conservative side are the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. The Prime Minister's now got a civil war on his hands and has to be careful that he doesn't make it worse by some of the briefing that Downing Street is behind. And the second most important man is, as I was saying earlier, among the walking wounded. I mean, will people listen?
No,
why will people listen to him on the referendum?
That's absolutely right, and that is why it's been a good weekend for the Brexiteers, and the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are tarnished. But at the end of the day, the British people, who after all are the most sophisticated political force in this country, will make a big picture decision based on the big picture arguments of what is the safest option, what is the riskiest option. And I'm not sure that these sort of great excitement and eruptions in the Westminster Village, I'm not sure whether they massively register with the British people when they're going to make a massive decision on big issues.
I think longer term there's a real concern here for the Conservative Party about their brand. Remember that they worked so hard to detoxify themselves in the run-up to the last elections. It wasn't convincing. You know, they only were in coalition. Now they only have the smallest of majorities. Now it looks like they're the nasty party again. They have been retoxified by this incident.
At a time when the whole strategy was to move to the centre ground.
Right, and it just hasn't worked. And if I were a Conservative strategist, I would be very concerned about the catastrophic damage to the party's brand.
Well, how has it come this January? The Prime Minister keeps on making speeches, normally every Monday, about the poor, about racial discrimination, about equality, all designed to position the Tories on the centre, even the centre-left ground, because they think Labour has left that. And yet they can still come up with the tax credits fiasco and now the disability fiasco. I mean, who's running the show?
Well, one problem is that it's very difficult to close the deficit once you've ring-fenced the NHS and everything else.
As we were saying to Mr Johnson.
Without
with the
making
IFS.
incursions into welfare. But they make it needlessly difficult and provocative when they juxtapose a cut in tax credits with a raising in the threshold of inheritance tax last year.
Capital gains tax this year.
CGT this
which
year.
Which only really affects the top 5%.
Yeah, and they kind of had to do it because it was in the manifesto, but it did not have to be in the manifesto. And it's that juxtaposition, rather than the exclusively the cuts to welfare, that proved to be so incendiary when it comes to public opinion.
So you say this has been a good weekend for Brexit. The backdrop, domestic backdrop, I would say, will exacerbate tensions between the Remain and Leave. It could turn really nasty. But meanwhile, there's an international dimension to this, and that is that the EU and Turkey have now come to some kind of agreement. I think it starts tonight. And here's a guess. I bet you it starts to unravel within 24 hours.
Well, it's the sort of thing that looks good on paper. You know, refugees who come over are sent back to Turkey, and then Syrian refugees that are in Turkey will be formally sent to Europe. And that looks great on paper. But just let's think about this in a practical level. These are people who have risked their lives, seen people drown in the Aegean Sea.
Lost family members.
They make it to Greece, and you're literally going to say to them, can you get back? Oh, fine, I'll do that. I would have thought on a practical level it is going to be really difficult to do. And don't forget, UN agencies have been saying they are not sure whether this is legal in the first place.
Because you cannot treat a group of migrants as a group. Under the Geneva Convention, they have to be treated as individuals. But this treats them as a group. And it's the kind of, if you start to see more unpleasant scenes out of Greece, more of a sense that the European Union just hasn't tackled this problem, that all adds to the Leave. It's grist to the Leave campaign's mill.
Yes, and I think that's a real source of alarm. And in fact, the broader debate about Turkey and its position and the possible prospect of Turkey in long term becoming part of the EU is extremely toxic. And I think that the out campaigns will be seeking to exploit every inch of that debate.
I'm with Nick that it's been a horrible week for the Remain campaign, politically and strategically, because of the Turkey issue and the refugees. Ultimately, the decision by swing voters, people who by definition are have no principled view on the subject, will be one based on quite big picture variables and factors. And ultimately, would you rather have the Prime Minister, still a credible, by all accounts, reasonably popular Prime Minister by historic standards, on your side? And you would. And it's a bigger asset than Ian Duncan Smith or even Boris Johnson or Michael Gove.
But one of the elements of the big picture now is the prospect of Turkey becoming a member of the European Union. That's a big picture that is unlikely to go down too well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'll be alive at the time Turkey joins the European Union.
Well, but
I won't go as
then
far
I
as-
would put it back to you, that means that the EU is basically lying to Turkey.
Well, the implicit thing about the deal they've had for 20 years is that you make progress towards membership. But, you know, I'm making progress towards becoming a millionaire. It's not going to happen.
I don't know, Janan.
I was in Luxembourg.
I was looking to you for a loan.
I was in Luxembourg 10.5 years ago on the night that those accession negotiations began. And the foreign minister of Turkey was made to wait in Ankara, and he eventually flew through the night, got there at 1 in the morning when Europe eventually said, yes, we'll start it. I don't think it's going to happen because don't forget this, there has to be a referendum in France to allow them to join, and the French will not vote in favour of Turkey.
No, I agree that it's not going to happen, but it's a kind of sleight of hand to imply to the Turks in order to get them to deal with the migrant crisis.
They know it. They just use it. They use it
Just to get the money.
To get the money and also to sneak through various
But
changes.
all the Brexiteers have to do is create the impression that it might happen, and it might happen sooner or later, and bingo, you're then going to scare an awful lot of
I
people.
think more worrying is how strategically dependent the West is now on Turkey and a Turkish government that they have very little control over.
And a Turkish government which is nothing like the Turkish government of 10 years ago when it seemed to be heading more in a Western democratic.
Which is why we're having to shut up about domestic Turkish affairs now, because we're so reliant on Erdogan.
Because they're only closing newspapers.
And locking people up. Yeah.
Right, we'll leave it there.
I've been getting away with it all